My mom said, "You'll never be as good as your sister." So I built a life 1,000 miles away. Now she wants to move in with me after losing everything. She says, "Family is all we have." Not anymore. There are certain words that do not simply scrape against your skin, but carve themselves into your very bones. For as long as I can remember, my mother's voice had been a constant background noise in my life. Not soothing like a lullaby, but grating, like the shriek of metal against metal. Every achievement, every tiny victory I celebrated, was inevitably met with a perfunctory shrug, or worse, a thinly veiled critique comparing me to the unreachable pinnacle that was my older sister. "You'll never be as good as her," she would murmur almost casually, as if it were not a dagger she was sliding between my ribs, but merely an innocuous observation, a simple truth I should accept without protest. Those words stitched themselves into the fabric of my self-worth, or rather, the absence of it. They festered, deepening into silent scars that no one could see but I felt with every breath I took. The walls of our home seemed built from layers of resentment, of expectations that were never meant for me to meet. Our family photos told a lopsided story. Smiling faces where I stood on the edges, half cut from the frame, while my sister occupied the center like a deity around which we were expected to orbit. School plays, report cards, soccer tournaments. Every milestone that might have once filled me with pride became another battleground where my worth was weighed and found wanting. I learned early on that approval was a currency I would never have enough of, and love, at least the way my mother dispensed it, came tethered to conditions I could never fulfill. Somewhere between surviving childhood and stumbling through adolescence, I decided that if I could not win her love, I would at least escape its venom. Leaving was not a dramatic act of rebellion. There were no tearful confrontations, no slammed doors or shouted confessions of hurt. It was quieter, like a soft exhale after holding my breath for too many years. I packed my car with the essentials of a life half-lived: clothes, old books, a battered laptop, and drove until the world that had wounded me was nothing more than a shrinking dot in my rearview mirror. 1,000 miles stretched between my past and the possibility of a different future, a chasm wide enough that I could finally start to breathe without choking on my own inadequacy. I found a small town that was nothing like the place I had fled. Quieter, slower, filled with people who knew nothing of my lineage or the judgments attached to it. Here, I could be whoever I chose to become, unshackled from the relentless echoes of comparison. Building a new life was not easy. There were nights I lay awake questioning whether I had made the right choice, days when loneliness gnawed at me with teeth almost as sharp as my mother's words had been. But with each small victory, a new job, a cozy apartment, friendships that grew slowly and sturdily like oaks rather than burning out like matches, I stitched together a version of myself that was whole, resilient, and quietly proud. I carved out a sanctuary where my worth was not measured against someone else's achievements, where my successes were not diminished by the shadow of a golden child who had always shone too brightly for me to stand near. Years trickled by like water smoothing the sharp edges of a stone. I became someone I barely recognized but deeply admired. Not flashy or grandiose, but steadfast, content, at peace. The bitter taste of my upbringing dulled with time, though it never fully disappeared. It lingered, a faint ghost in the corners of my mind, a reminder of where I had come from and why I had needed to leave. I told myself that I had closed that chapter, that some wounds, though faded, were better left undisturbed. I never imagined she would find her way back into my life, trailing behind her the wreckage of her own making. When the call came, it was like a punch to the gut, dredging up emotions I had long since buried beneath layers of hard-earned tranquility. Her voice on the other end of the line was brittle, cracking under the weight of a desperation I had never heard from her before. She had lost everything, she said: the house, the savings, the friends who had once buzzed around her like moths to a flame. There was no mention of my sister, the golden child who had somehow disappeared from the narrative. Only me, the afterthought, the one she had deemed never good enough, was left to shoulder the burden of her collapse. "I have nowhere else to go," she whispered, and I could hear the tremble she was trying so hard to conceal. "Family is all we have." The words landed heavily, but they did not pierce as they once might have. There was a strange detachment in me, a clarity sharpened by years of distance and growth, Family, I realized, is not simply blood or obligation. It is love freely given, support unwavering, respect without strings. It is not a weapon to be wielded when convenient, nor a guilt trip packaged in the language of sentimentality. Family lifts you when you stumble, not pushes you down to watch you fall harder. She spoke of mistakes, of regret, of wanting to make amends. Each apology felt like a stone skipping across a vast lake, touching the surface but never sinking deep enough to disturb the depths. Part of me ached for the child I had been, the one who had so desperately craved these words. But another part, the wiser part, understood that sometimes closure does not come wrapped in the apologies we thought we needed. Sometimes closure is simply the ability to hear the pleas for forgiveness and realize that you no longer owe anyone your suffering. As I listened to her plead, to weave together a tapestry of past sorrows and present needs, I glanced around the home I had built. Every book on the shelf, every photograph framed on the wall, every creak in the floorboards under my feet was a testament to the life I had fought tooth and nail to create. A life free from the suffocating comparisons, the casual cruelty masquerading as parenting, the endless hunger for validation that had once consumed me. To invite her into this space would not merely be an act of kindness. It would be a betrayal of the years it had taken me to reclaim my own soul. Still, guilt gnawed at the edges of my resolve, whispering insidious doubts in my ear. Had I grown so cold, so unforgiving, that I could turn away someone in need? But the deeper truth, the one that had crystallized in the hard-fought quiet of my new existence, was that survival sometimes demands we protect ourselves, even from those who claim to love us, especially from them. I told her I needed time to think, my voice steady despite the tempest raging inside me. She agreed, though disappointment saturated every syllable. When I hung up, the silence that followed was both oppressive and liberating, pressing against my chest and lifting from my shoulders all at once. That night, sleep eluded me. Memories flickered behind my closed eyelids like a cruel slideshow, birthdays spent in the shadows, report cards dismissed with a sniff, scraped knees ignored while my sister's minor triumphs were celebrated with parades. The past refused to be neatly boxed away. It seeped into the cracks of my carefully constructed life, demanding acknowledgement. I understood then that forgiving her, if that was even possible, did not have to mean sacrificing myself again. It did not mean flinging wide the doors of my sanctuary and inviting in the storm she carried with her. Morning came cloaked in a heavy gray mist, the sun a shy stranger behind thick clouds. I brewed coffee mechanically, the rich aroma grounding me in the present even as my mind spun in circles. Somewhere, a life was unraveling, and its frayed ends were reaching out for me to stitch them back together. But I had my own tapestry now, one woven from resilience, autonomy, and a fierce kind of love for the person I had become despite everything. I was no longer the child straining toward an unattainable love, no longer the afterthought trying to earn a place at a table where the feast was always meant for someone else. The doorbell rang, sharp and unexpected, slicing through the stillness. I froze, coffee cup halfway to my lips, heart pounding an uneven rhythm against my ribs. Part of me already knew, even before I crossed the room and peered through the narrow window beside the door. There she stood, small and unfamiliar in her vulnerability, clutching a battered suitcase that seemed to contain the remnants of a life that had once towered over mine. She had come, not with threats or anger, but with hope, fragile and trembling in her hands like a wounded bird. And now, the decision I had wrestled with in the dark hours of the night was standing on my doorstep, shivering in the cold. The question was no longer whether I could forgive her. It was whether I could afford to let her back into the life I had built, knowing that some wounds, once reopened, do not close again so easily. For a long moment, I simply stared at her, my hand hesitating on the doorknob, as if by merely touching it, I might open not just the door, but an entire floodgate of memories I had so painstakingly sealed away. Her eyes, once sharp and full of the relentless judgment that had defined my childhood, now seemed smaller, dimmer, shaded by a weariness I almost did not recognize. In another life, perhaps, I would have rushed to embrace her, to offer comfort and shelter without question. But that life had been crushed beneath the endless comparisons, the sharp criticisms, the cold, dismissive glances that made it clear I had always been measured and found lack. She shifted from foot to foot, her hands tightening around the handle of her suitcase, as if she could anchor herself against the rising tide of uncertainty. I could see the defeat written in the sag of her shoulders, the way her once impeccable hair now clung limp and listless around her face. She looked so small standing there, framed by the gray morning light, but it did not make her seem less dangerous to me. Sometimes the greatest harm comes wrapped in the most familiar forms, cloaked not in malice, but in need. When I finally opened the door, it was only a crack, a sliver wide enough for my voice to slip through, but not my heart. "Why are you here?" The question was blunt, devoid of the softness she might have expected from the daughter she had once molded with scorn and backhanded affection. Her mouth opened and closed several times before any sound emerged, as if she were struggling to remember how to ask for something without the armor of superiority she had worn for so long. "I told you on the phone," she said, her voice hoarse and frayed. "I have nowhere else." I said nothing, letting the silence between us stretch until it became almost unbearable. I wanted her to feel the weight of it, to understand that this was not the homecoming she might have imagined, that my life was no longer a stage for her tragedies and triumphs. After a long pause, she added, "Please, just for a little while, until I get back on my feet." The absurdity of her words nearly made me laugh. Back on her feet? As if the woman standing before me bore even a passing resemblance to the one who had once held court with effortless cruelty, surrounded by admirers who fed her ego like loyal subjects tending a monarch. She was adrift now, a queen without a kingdom, and I, the child she had banished to the margins, was somehow expected to provide safe harbor. My better instincts warred with my hard-earned wisdom. Compassion whispered that she was still my mother, still human, still deserving of kindness. But survival, the raw, bleeding instinct that had driven me 1,000 miles away and kept me standing through years of loneliness, cautioned that opening the door any wider could cost me everything I had built. Without saying a word, I stepped aside, allowing her entrance not because she had earned it, but because part of me needed to see what would happen next. She moved past me with a tentative shuffle, her suitcase trailing behind her like a wounded limb. I closed the door with a quiet click, the sound echoing through the house like a gavel striking the end of an old trial. She stood awkwardly in the middle of my living room, eyes darting around as if cataloging the evidence of the life I had built without her. The sturdy, worn bookshelves lined with titles she would never have approved of. The cozy furniture that bore no trace of the sterile perfection she had demanded in her own home. The framed photographs of friends who had become my chosen family. Smiles genuine and wide, free from the strain of conditional love. There was a moment when our gazes met, and in that brief collision of eyes, 1,000 unspoken truths passed between us. I saw in her the remnants of the woman who had once loomed so large in my life, and she saw in me the stranger I had become, someone who no longer craved her approval, no longer bent beneath the weight of her disappointment. I'll just stay out of your way," she murmured, setting down her suitcase with a soft thud. The words were an apology in themselves, or perhaps an admission of guilt so long delayed that it no longer mattered. I nodded, though inside my chest a war raged between conflicting loyalties. I had once dreamed of this moment, back when I was too young to understand that some debts are better left unpaid. I had imagined her coming to me, admitting she had been wrong, seeking forgiveness I would heroically bestow. But reality, as always, was messier, uglier, tinged with the sour taste of pity and resentment. In the days that followed, our uneasy coexistence settled into a pattern. She stayed mostly in the spare room, venturing out only to cook small meals or sit stiffly on the edge of the couch, hands twisting nervously in her lap. I went about my routines with a studied indifference, though every movement, every word, felt magnified under her gaze. Conversations were shallow, filled with strained pleasantries and pregnant silences that neither of us dared to breach. Sometimes I caught her staring at me with an expression I could not easily decipher, part sorrow, part bewilderment, part something else I dared not name. Perhaps she was realizing the cost of her favoritism, the lives it had warped, the bridges it had burned beyond repair. Or perhaps she was simply mourning her own fall from grace, grieving not what she had done to me, but what she had lost for herself. One afternoon, as rain drummed against the windows in steady, mournful beats, she broached the subject we had both so carefully avoided. "I know I wasn't kind," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I thought I was pushing you to be better, to be stronger." I stared at her, feeling the old, familiar anger stir within me like a beast roused from uneasy slumber. Pushing me to be better? Was that what she thought she had been doing all those years, pitting me against my sister like gladiators in a cruel, endless contest? Had she ever truly seen me? Or was I always just a reflection of my failures to her? "You didn't push me," I said quietly, forcing the words past the tightness in my throat. "You crushed me." She flinched as if struck, but I did not relent. If this uncomfortable truce between us was to survive even a single day longer, it had to be built on the truth she had spent a lifetime avoiding. "I spent years believing I would never be enough," I continued, each syllable falling heavy between us. "Not for you. Not for anyone. I left because it was the only way to survive. You didn't make me stronger. I made myself stronger. Without you." Tears welled in her eyes, but I found no satisfaction in them. They were too little, too late, an offering left on an altar long abandoned. "I'm sorry," she choked out, voice breaking under the strain of sincerity. "I was wrong." There was a time when those words would have broken me open, would have had me running into her arms, desperate to believe in redemption. But now they felt hollow, a salve too weak for wounds too deep. "I know you are," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But I don't know if that's enough." The rain outside intensified, a steady roar that seemed to swallow the world beyond our fragile bubble. In that moment, we sat together in silence. Two broken people adrift in the wreckage of a shared past, neither could fully escape. Night fell like a shroud over the house, and still she remained, a ghost haunting the corridors of my hard-won peace. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much of my life I was willing to sacrifice to guilt and obligation, wondering if forgiveness was a gift I could afford to give, or a luxury that would cost me more than I had left to give. The days stretched into weeks, and slowly, the rhythm of our uneasy existence settled into something almost resembling normalcy. But the tension never fully eased, always lurking beneath the surface like a submerged reef waiting to tear open the hull of our fragile truce. One evening, as the first hints of autumn painted the sky in bruised purples and fiery golds, she approached me in the kitchen, where I was absently stirring a pot of soup. "I found a place," she said, her voice tentative. I looked up, surprised. "It's not much," she continued, fiddling with the hem of her sweater. "Just a little apartment. I can move in next week." Relief washed over me in a tidal wave so strong it nearly knocked me off balance. But intertwined with it was a thin thread of unexpected sadness, not for the end of her presence in my home, but for the realization that, even now, part of me had still hoped for something more, some magic moment of healing, some neat resolution to the years of hurt. But life, I had learned, rarely offered such clean endings. "That's good," I said, managing a small smile. She nodded, her own smile shaky but genuine. "Thank you for letting me stay." As she turned away, her footsteps soft against the worn hardwood floors, I felt the tight knot inside my chest loosen just a fraction. Perhaps some distances could never be fully bridged. Perhaps some wounds would always ache when touched. But in this moment, I realized that healing was not about pretending the past had never happened. It was about learning to live with the scars and choosing, every day, not to let them define me. Yet even as I stood there, watching her retreat down the hall, I could not shake the feeling that the past was not finished with us yet. That somewhere, just beyond the horizon, another reckoning waited, and this time, I would be ready. The week leading to her departure unfurled with an unsettling quiet, a deceptive peace that hinted not at reconciliation, but at exhaustion. We moved around each other like planets caught in the same orbit yet bound by unspoken laws never to collide. I would find her sitting in the kitchen sometimes, fingers curled around a chipped mug of tea, eyes staring out the window as though searching for answers in the brittle autumn light. There was a fragility to her now, a brittleness that had replaced the ironclad woman who once ruled my life with a glance or a sharp word. It should have made it easier to let go, to sever the final fraying strands between us, but instead it stirred an ache deep within my chest, a grief for the mother I had wanted and never had. On the surface, Everything appeared normal. She packed her few belongings neatly into battered suitcases. She organized papers at the kitchen table with careful precision. She made lists, checked off tasks, prepared for her exit with a kind of grim efficiency. Yet underneath it all, a current of sadness pulsed, heavy, slow, inevitable, as if we both knew we were not just saying goodbye to shared space, but to any lingering illusions that time or circumstance could heal what years of neglect and favoritism had left broken. One evening, as the sky blushed deep violet and the first hints of winter sharpened the air, I found her in the living room, leafing through an old photo album she must have discovered tucked away on a forgotten shelf. The sight of her fingers, trembling slightly as they traced the edges of faded photographs, sent a jolt of something sharp and unnameable through me. She looked up when she heard me enter, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You kept these," she said softly, as if the realization astonished her. I shrugged, uncomfortable under the sudden weight of her gaze. "They are part of my life, whether I like it or not." She turned a page with infinite gentleness, revealing a photo that made my breath hitch. There we were, my sister and me, standing side by side at some long-ago family picnic. My sister beamed, radiant even in childhood, her arms thrown wide in a gesture of exuberant joy. I stood beside her, smaller, quieter, my smile tentative, unsure whether I was allowed to fully claim the happiness captured in that fleeting moment. "I was so proud of you, you know," she said, her voice cracking. The laugh that escaped me was not cruel, but it was bitter. "You had a funny way of showing it." She closed the album with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "I thought if I pushed you hard enough you would shine. I didn't realize I was dimming your light." There it was again. The belated apology, the too late understanding. Part of me wanted to accept it, to let those words smooth over the jagged edges still embedded deep within me. Another part, harder and wiser, knew that wounds left untended for too long become part of the very fabric of who you are. They shape you in ways no apology can unmake. I sat across from her, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling. "You didn't just dim it. You made me doubt I ever had a light at all." The words hung between us, raw and unforgiving, and for once, she did not try to defend herself. She only nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks unchecked, carving silent paths through the lines time and sorrow had etched into her face. The moment passed, as all moments do, but it left a residue behind, a sticky film of sadness and regret that clung to everything. The next few days blurred into one another, each marked by a strange, brittle politeness that neither of us dared to break. I drove her to her new apartment without ceremony. The car ride filled with small talk, so strained it was almost farcical. When we arrived, I helped carry her suitcases up the narrow, creaking stairs to a third-floor walk-up that smelled faintly of mildew and old regrets. The apartment was tiny, barely more than a single room with a kitchenette squeezed into one corner and a battered mattress slumped against the opposite wall. She looked around with a brave smile that did not reach her eyes. "It's not much," she said brightly, too brightly. "But it'll do." I nodded, setting her bags down carefully, unsure what to say. There was no grand speech, no dramatic farewell, just a quiet, mutual understanding that whatever relationship we might rebuild would be slow, cautious, and forever shadowed by the past. As I turned to leave, she caught my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not just for the ride, not just for the temporary shelter, but for everything. For surviving her, for surviving myself." I drove home under a bruised sky, the city lights smearing the windshield with golden tears. My house felt cavernous without her, empty in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. I moved through the rooms, reacquainting myself with the solitude I had once fought so hard to achieve. The silence was no longer lonely. It was sacred, a testament to battles fought and boundaries established. Yet even in the sanctuary of my home, her presence lingered like smoke after a fire. Memories surfaced unbidden, the way she used to braid my hair too tightly, the sharpness of her voice when I brought home anything less than perfection, the rare, fleeting moments of approval that felt like sunlight through storm clouds. They came not to torment me, but to remind me that healing was not a destination but a journey, one I would walk for the rest of my life. Days turned into weeks, and life resumed its familiar rhythm. Work, friends, the small, steady rituals that gave shape to my existence. I saw her occasionally, brief visits where the conversation stayed safely above the depth where old wounds might fester. She spoke of her new job at a local library, shelving books in the quiet hours of the morning. She mentioned joining a knitting circle, laughing at her own clumsy attempts to create something tangible, something whole. And yet, beneath the surface, I could feel the gravity of her loneliness pulling at her, a silent plea she never voiced aloud. She wanted more time, more forgiveness, more of the closeness she had squandered when I was too young to protect myself. But I had learned too well the cost of giving without boundaries, of loving without safeguards. I would not lose myself again, not even for her. One chilly afternoon, as I sipped coffee in the local cafe where I often worked, she appeared at my table, her coat dusted with early snowflakes. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the cold and the burdens she carried. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, tentative. I gestured to the chair across from me, wary but unwilling to cause a scene. She hesitated, then plunged forward, the words spilling out of her in a rush. "I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything. I know I've hurt you in ways I can never fully repair, but I miss you. I miss my daughter." The ache that blossomed in my chest was sharp, but it did not undo me. I breathed through it, anchoring myself in the life I had built, the strength I had forged in the crucible of her indifference. "I'm not the little girl you remember," I said, my voice steady. "And you're not the mother I needed." She bowed her head, accepting the truth without argument. "But," I continued, choosing my words with care, "maybe we can start from here. As two people, not as mother and daughter. No expectations, no demands." Her eyes shone with tears, but she nodded, a small, trembling motion that spoke volumes. We sat there for a long time, two wounded souls finding, if not forgiveness, then at least a fragile kind of peace. The road ahead would be uncertain, filled with pitfalls and setbacks, but for the first time it felt like a road we might walk, not as a family defined by blood and obligation, but as individuals choosing, day by day, whether to continue. As I looked out the window at the falling snow, blanketing the world in clean, quiet white, I realized that healing was not a moment of arrival, but 1,000 small choices made in the face of old pain. Choices to stand, to speak, to hope. And somewhere deep within me, a voice, my own voice clear and unwavering, whispered that I was enough. I had always been enough. No matter what anyone had said, no matter what anyone had failed to see, the past was a shadow. But I was the light, and this story was far from over. Winter pressed its cold hands against the town with an unrelenting grip, frosting the sidewalks in a thin sheen of ice that crackled underfoot. I watched from the window as the world outside dulled into muted tones, the trees stripped bare, the streets wrapped in a somber hush. It felt fitting, somehow, that the season of endings had finally arrived, mirroring the quiet resolution blooming inside me. My relationship with her, with the woman who had birthed me, shaped me, and wounded me in equal measure, had reached a crossroads that could no longer be delayed. We had tried, in our clumsy, tentative way, to build a bridge over the chasm of our shared history. We had met for coffee, exchanged halting conversations, even smiled at one another without the bitterness that once poisoned every glance. But beneath the surface, a truth pulsed with relentless certainty. Some distances were not meant to be crossed. It was not anger that fueled this realization, nor the old, familiar ache of longing. It was a deep, abiding clarity, a recognition that forgiveness did not require reunion, and love did not demand proximity. Sometimes the kindest thing you could do for both yourself and those who had harmed you was to walk away, not in rage, but in peace. One evening, after the sun had bled out behind the horizon in a spectacular burst of crimson and gold, I invited her to my home one last time. The invitation was simple, without ceremony, without promises. She arrived bundled in a thick coat, a knitted scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, her breath misting in the frigid air. There was a cautious hope in her eyes, the kind that clutched too tightly to fragile possibilities, and for a fleeting moment, I mourned the woman she might have been had life unfolded differently. We sat across from each other in the living room, the silence between us stretching and settling like dust in an abandoned house. I offered her a cup of tea, which she accepted with trembling hands. For a long while we simply sat there, the weight of unspoken words coiling around us. Finally I spoke, my voice steady, deliberate. "I think it's time we both stopped pretending." She flinched, but to her credit she did not interrupt. She only nodded, her fingers tightening around the mug. "I needed you to be someone you couldn't be," I continued, the words carving through the air with gentle finality. "And you needed me to be someone I never was. We spent so many years hurting each other because we kept trying to fit into roles neither of us could fill." Her eyes shone with unshed tears, but she did not look away. "I don't hate you," I said, surprising even myself with the truth of it. "I don't wish you harm. I hope you find happiness, in whatever form it takes. But I can't carry this anymore. I can't carry us." The sob that escaped her was small, broken, the sound of a dam finally giving way. She set the mug down carefully, as if afraid that even that small noise might shatter the fragile moment. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words hoarse with sincerity. "I was so wrong. I see it now. I see all of it." I believed her, but it did not change what had been lost, nor could it rebuild the years I had spent trying to earn a love that should have been unconditional. "I know," I said softly, "and I forgive you. But forgiveness doesn't mean things go back to how they were. Forgiveness just means I refuse to let the pain define me anymore." She reached across the coffee table, her hand outstretched in a silent plea. For a moment I hesitated, staring at that familiar hand, the hand that had once pulled me close and pushed me away in equal measure. Then gently, I placed my own hand in hers, not to cling, but to say goodbye. We sat like that for a while, the past folding itself neatly behind us like an old letter finally sealed and put away. When she left that night, she did not ask when we would see each other again. She did not demand anything more from me. She simply pressed a kiss to my forehead, her lips cool and trembling, and walked into the night without looking back. I closed the door behind her and leaned against it, letting the tears come freely. Not tears of grief, but of release, the kind of tears that cleanse rather than wound. I was free, truly, utterly free. In the weeks that followed, life unfolded with a surprising lightness. I embraced the silence of my home not as loneliness, but as sanctuary. I spent weekends wandering through museums, letting art and history wrap around me like a balm. I took long drives along the coast, the salty wind tangling in my hair as I chased sunsets and stitched new memories into the fabric of my life. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to let people in again, not out of desperation, but from a place of abundance. Friends who had stood patiently at the edges of my healing were welcomed with open arms. I hosted small dinners, filled my home with laughter and warmth, redefined what family meant on my own terms. One evening, as I sat curled in an armchair with a book and a blanket, the fireplace crackling softly nearby, I realized that I had built something remarkable. A life rooted not in escape, but in creation. A life where love was freely given and freely received, untainted by comparison or conditional approval. My phone buzzed on the side table, pulling me from my thoughts. A message from a friend popped up, inviting me to a weekend hiking trip. I smiled, feeling the simple joy of being wanted, not because of what I could provide or achieve, but simply because of who I was. Without hesitation, I typed back a yes. As I set the phone down, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. A woman shaped by hardship, yes, but not defined by it. A woman who had carved a path through the wilderness of her own making and emerged whole, radiant, unbreakable. The past would always be a part of me, a constellation of scars and lessons etched into my soul, but it no longer held the power to cage me. It was merely a chapter, important, formative, but no longer the entire story. My mother remained a distant presence, a muted figure in the background of my life. We exchanged occasional postcards, brief updates that spoke more of civility than intimacy. It was enough, more than enough. I wished her peace, and in doing so, gifted myself the same. As the seasons shifted once again and spring unfurled its green fingers across the land, I stood on my porch one morning, coffee in hand, and breathed in the sweet, damp air. The world was alive with renewal, with promise. Birds chattered in the trees, the sun warmed my skin, and somewhere deep within, a quiet certainty took root. I had survived. I had thrived.